Hello viewers, welcome to another episode of Liberating Minds. My name is Maghanga from the Revolutionary Socialist League, and with me here today is
Sobukwe Shukura with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And of course, I've been here before, and I'm always happy to come back and chop it up with you, comrades.
It's always a pleasure having you around. Yeah. When we have Sobukwe, you know this is going to be a really powerful episode. So today we're going to talk about Kimathi, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi,
right,
who is our shujaa, who is somebody whose struggle inspires us every single day. So we're going to talk about Kimathi because we are approaching the Kimathi Day, which is due to be commemorated on the 18th of February. Therefore, our episode today is going to talk about Kimathi, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi. Yes. So, Comrade Sobukwe, who is Dedan Kimathi?
Well, I think that's it's a complicated question on one hand, because of course you can think about Kimathi as the individual and his work as a freedom fighter, an African freedom fighter, a part of the history of African resistance, who carries on from those who started the resistance at every level, from the beginning of the enslavement of our people to the colonization of our people and the stealing of our land and resources. So he can be seen as a continuation of that, and we don't want to think of him outside of that. But he made some particular contributions to the struggle in Kenya. And I think if we just summed it up by his own words, when we think about when he said, "I would rather die on my feet than to live on my knees," he was telling us that our struggle is one for dignity and a reconstitution of our freedom that we had prior to the interruption of slavery and colonization. So when we think about him in that sense, we think about him as someone who, like we are going to say later, that Dedan lives. He's not something of a past. He physically is no longer with us, but certainly his inspiration, his leadership is something that we're going to continue to live off of. We think about him rising inside of the Land and Freedom Army from his role as one of the junior leaders to the one who would be known, as you said, as the field marshal, the one who was a brilliant strategist, the one who refused, even when others wanted to give up, to go and surrender to the British without fighting and giving his life ultimately. And the only thing I can say is not enough is said about him in the African Revolution and the importance of the struggle of what we now have called the Mau Mau, but really the Land and Freedom Army, in terms of being so important to the whole struggle on the African continent. And we know in that period there's really that struggle and the struggle in Algiers by FLN in terms of struggling against the French. But in terms of the British colonies, this was one of the major jump off spots in the anti-colonial struggle. Yes.
You've talked about the Land and Freedom Army,
yes,
also known as the Mau Mau. What was this army? What was this movement? What were its objectives? What did it really fight for?
Well, I think its name says it all. It was fighting for the land. And I think it gives us an opportunity to talk about why. What were the conditions? Why was this struggle come to an head? We got to understand that the struggle begins because of the taking of land from British colonialism, and their cohorts who came as businessmen and collaborated with the royal family in Britain to take land from the African people. They took what we now call the North Highlands. They took a lot of land, and there was also other groups in the area who lost land. And it's this that accumulated over the years. Because as we talk about it, by the time that World War I took place, they had already stolen over 4 million acres of land. By the time that World War II ended, they had taken 16,000 miles of land. And when we think about 16,000 miles, represents more than 10.5 million acres of land. So this is what the struggle that produced the Land and Freedom Army. And it's not, of course, and we can never take it out of history. We have to understand that there had already been a struggle. There had already been the struggle of Katalili and many others who fought against the British, fought against their colonial plans, fought for their land back. There had already been the struggles. But when you think about it, that juncture, now we're talking about they're up to 16,000 miles of land, more than 10 million acres. Now it's almost impossible for the people to live, because it wasn't just the land. On top of the land, they took labor. They forced people to labor for them, and they, on top of their labor and the penance they were getting for their labor, they put a tax on the people. They put a tax on the people so that the people were forced to sell their labor to them even when they had their own land. So the idea is right now we're in a pinch. It reminds me of what are the kinds of conditions that we're looking at now, with land not being in the hands of the masses, and with taxation becoming, taking the form of really reducing the people's ability to take care of themselves independently, an impossible proposition. And I think that when we think about the oathing, the people going to the forest, we're saying that this can be sustained. Our lives cannot be sustained without fighting for our land back and fighting to displace these settlers from controlling the best land. Because it's not just they took the 16,000 miles of land, is they took the best land. The land that was most fertile, the land that the people produced their food on. And now the people are forced to work for them, to give their labor to the people who have stolen their land. So it's insult to injury. And now you're saying you're going to tax? You're going to tax us on top of that? You're going to say that the penance, the 25 shillings a day that we're making, now you're going to tax that. And then they went to tax even those who have been driven off their land and maybe now were working for as soldiers or working in somewhere for the colonial administration. Now they go to tax them also. So now what is the alternative but to fight? So that's what they represent. They represent taking on a colonial settler army and a colonial administration. They went to the forest. They oathed. They said that they wouldn't, nobody could give up. That you were going into this as a struggle that would go on until we win. And that's why many of the Land and Freedom Army, even when this deal was made with, so-called deal was made with Kanu and the other forces that went to become the new government, refused to end the struggle because the land and the resources, the land and their labor had not been reconstituted, have not been freed. And even today, millions of acres are still held in the hands of settlers in the highlands. And when we look at that and we compare it again to the masses of people who are crowded into the urban areas, we've said it a couple times on a couple interviews, that we are here in Nairobi alone. We're talking about 55% of the population living on less than a few acres of land in these informal areas. The people are basically living crowded with, where everything is, in shortage: water, clean water, and decent shelter. It's really a dangerous place to have thousands of people living in these informal areas where others are still benefiting from their theft in the North Highlands. So I think what they symbolize to us is a struggle, a willingness, and all of us need a new oath that we won't stop struggling, we won't stop fighting until our land and resources are returned to us. But they didn't just do that in terms of, again, creating that condition and that attitude for Kenya, but for the Pan-African world. When we think about people like Malcolm X and people like W.E.B. Du Bois, that Field Marshal sent the charter of the Land and Freedom Army to W.E.B. Du Bois to have a look at it. And W.E.B. Du Bois, if anybody knows, is sometimes called the father of Pan-Africanism, the one who wanted a total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, who was studying and trying to understand the struggle of African people. Some of these figures that I'm using today were also given by a piece written by George Padmore. George Padmore was also a significant Pan-African leader who was born in the Caribbean. So he was studying and also being inspired by the likes of the Mau Mau, or the Land and Freedom Army. And see, the enemy made a mistake. They thought by calling the Land and Freedom Army the Mau Mau that it would strike fear to Europeans and others in the world and make them think like, oh, this is a terrorist group. But it backfired. It might have frightened some of those colonizers, but it inspired Africans around the world. It inspired us. When we heard about the Mau Mau fighting against colonialism in the diaspora and other places on the continent of Africa, we were inspired. We were ready. We felt like we needed a Mau. Like Malcolm said, we need a Mau Mau right here in the U.S., in Harlem. And then the civil rights leaders said that we need a Mau Mau right here in Mississippi. So this is to understand that this term Mau Mau inspired Africans, and our resistance around the world cannot be understated.
Really comprehensively about the conditions that led to the rise of the Land and Freedom Army or the Mau Mau. What really made it imperative that people go to the forest and fight for what is theirs, and of course the inspiration that this brought about to the rest of the world, not only the people of Africa, but the rest of the world who are continuing the struggle against imperialism and against capitalism in general. Having said that, if we look at the conditions today, do we feel that the conditions that led to the rise of the Land and Freedom Army, to the struggle that Kimathi engaged in, do we feel that these conditions still exist today, and what is to be done? Also, the second part of that question is, what do you feel is the relevance of Kimathi's struggle and the Land and Freedom Army struggle in the struggle that's going on today?
Well, I think it's obviously, we talked about that Dedan Kimathi allowed himself to be hung rather than to give up and surrender. and tell the Mau Mau army to come out of the field. He was willing to give his life. But we understood that there were others who were not willing to give them their lives, and who were willing to compromise, to say, okay, if you give a few of us land, and you don't have to give back the majority of the 10 million acres, 16,000 miles of land. You don't have to. We're going to now have a relationship with the British. We'll be a part of the Commonwealth. But we have to understand, like you said, this whole notion of what are you really doing? Because there's capitalism at the stage that it was when colonization started, when they needed to take over vast portions of the global South. When capitalism got to the point in 1900 that it needed colonies around the world, permanent colonies, they had taken over the land and resources of the majority of the global South. So now we're in this situation. Organizations like the Commonwealth, or the Francophone countries, and all of these so-called European collaborations with Africa were not collaborations at all. They were continuations of an imperial relationship. Now we're going from traditional colonialism to a continuation of imperialism under the name of neo-colonialism. And in places like Kenya, South Africa, and others, settler colonialism was never reversed. So now we have the land and resources still in the hands primarily of settlers in the settler colonial states and in the hands of foreign corporations in places, whereas colonialism was not at a settler stage. And all we mean is that in settler colonial states, large populations of Europeans came and took just unthinkable amounts of land, because it wasn't like they became the over majority of the people in the settler states. Still, there's the Europeans in Kenya are very few. Comparatively, Europeans are still small. But when you think about how they got and how much land they were getting per individual, when you're talking about people coming and get 100,000 acres of land, or 200 or 300,000 acres of land, even in their small numbers, economically and socially, politically, they had great power in terms of what was to be done in the country. So right now, we're looking at imperialism as a collaboration between a ruling class and the continued exploitation of the masses of the working class people. So when we think about it, our national liberation anywhere among African people has not been completed. No matter where you look, or among African people, we have not completed our national liberation struggle, because we have not taken back the control of our land and resources and labor. And until that happens, then this struggle is really, we don't want to say we didn't win some victories. Certainly when our comrades were willing to go into the forest, they created the conditions for where we are now, to even have the level of freedom that we have now. But we must understand today, and we must be more clear today, that the desperation of the so-called West, the so-called NATO countries, is higher today than it's ever been. Because there has been a level of resistance. There has been a pushback. They are now facing the reality. They face, of course, the major revolutions that led to the Soviet Union and China. which freed up quite a bit of land and resources around the world. But now we're dealing with the fact that China is overcoming them economically and building relationships in the world not based on imperialism, not based upon taking over the land and resources of the people. So, and we're dealing with Russia that is not going to allow NATO to surround it and put nuclear weapons in its backyard. And we're looking at a U.S. and Europe that is growing weaker and more desperate. And when something becomes more desperate, it becomes more dangerous. Now, as Africa makes deals and makes alliances and relationships to the BRICS and themselves and other countries that make the U.S. feel like they are no longer the only game in town, that the World Bank and the IMF is no longer the only place that you can do exchange or borrow money, the U.S. becomes more desperate. And if they are willing to kill 100,000 people out of 2 million people in Palestine, what do you think they're willing to do to regain what they feel that they've lost in Africa and Kenya and places like that? We have to remember now, when fighting and taking those 10 million acres of land, it was done with blood. They killed, and when we were fighting them, for every one we killed of them, there were at least 100 of us. So we lost hundreds of thousands of people. And if we look at an African continent, we lost millions and millions of people. We lost 14 million people alone in Congo under Belgian colonialism. So right now, what are they doing in the Congo? The same thing, creating wars, aiding wars to kill as many people as they need to keep control of the resources. And this is where it becomes critical to understand what Dedan was saying. He was saying, look, they are going to continue to kill, rape our land and resources unless we are willing to fight back. We have to organize ourselves. We have to organize ourselves for what neo-colonialism's desperation will lead to. What will it mean in Kenya? What does it mean now to see someone like Bill Gates? What does it mean to have a Bill Gates going out into the countryside and trying to put his GMO seeds everywhere? What will it mean to our future generations if we don't solve the problem of not being able to produce enough food and to become completely food dependent? What does it mean to start passing laws for imperialism that you have to have a license to farm, that you have to pay taxes on your land, to reduce even more land that the average Kenyan has, to produce food for their families and food for the marketplace that comes and grown in Kenya, that doesn't belong to a big tea company, that doesn't belong to a big coffee company, that doesn't belong to a big pineapple corporation. This is what it means. We have to know where we are. But it's not all bleak because there's a changing world. But we have to be conscious. We have to have the same consciousness that we would rather die on our feet than live on our knees. But we're talking about, we have 55 million people. And if they are properly organized, we can regain our footing. Because that 55 million is part of a continent of 1 billion African people. And that 1 billion African people on the continent also is represented in the diaspora outside the continent in the hundreds of millions. Us properly organized with the control of our land and resources can change our conditions. And I think that this is what is frightening the West. But we have to be conscious. We have to be conscious that it's not one generational struggle. And it can never be just one generational struggle. We praise, again, the activity that has come up around this taxation, the struggle of young folks from the Gen Z. But they have to understand that their struggle is only possible because of the folks who went to the forest. And their struggle can only be a stepping stone for the next generation that we expect to be fully free and united on the African continent. We see these struggles like in the Sahel, in the changing understanding. It's not just about one generation in the Sahel. It's about many generations in the Sahel, because the Sahel Union that is going on now was preceded all the way back in the 60s by a block of countries that came together, Ghana, Mali, and Guinea-Conakry. So we have to understand that it's not a pop-up. It is an organized struggle with a clear analysis of who are your enemies and who are your friends and what are you fighting against. We know, again, in this period, we're not dealing with the imperialism and colonialism of the era in which we talk about Dedan Kimathi, but we're dealing with neo-colonialism and the imperialism of the day. And we have to smash neo-colonial control. We need a national revolution that, again, takes back the land and resources in Africa. And certainly Kenya is in Africa, so it's a part of that struggle.
Yes, indeed it is.
Yes.
And lastly, in order to carry out the struggle, if we reference the struggle that we've talked about during the time of Kimathi and, the people that were struggling against settler colonialism and against imperialism at that time, we see that they formed the Land and Freedom Army in order to pursue this struggle. What does this say about the need for organization?
Again, and this is a continuation of what I'm saying. When Kwame Nkrumah talked about the question that the African continent needs an all-African people's army, that means that we need our people. Here we have armies in 54, 55 countries that are on the African continent. Yet not one of them can stave off a British invasion, a U.S. invasion, and certainly not a NATO invasion. When we see what happened back in 2011 in Libya, we see that the African Union could not do anything. They didn't have resources to send. They didn't have an army to send to fight imperialism. So today we have to look at the question of how do we organize? How we organize even in one state in Africa? Are we, how does neo-colonial continue to strive and move forward? Because the masses of our people are not in organizations. So we have these political parties, these neo-colonial political parties, these capitalist bourgeois political parties who come out every year, mobilize our people. And because we're not organized, we can only vote for them. We make a choice between Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We don't make a choice between one ideology and another ideology, one party who represents the masses and a party that doesn't represent the masses. We don't have that party yet that represents the masses. And until we have parties that represent the masses, that organize the people into these political parties so they can sit down and talk about what is it that they really want and not be dictated to and thrown a coin and said, come help me mobilize the people. I'll give you a few quarters or a few shillings in this case, and you go out and you mobilize your neighborhood, or you give the neighborhood preacher a few pennies, and he tells his delegation to vote for this one or vote for that one, but none of them representing the masses of the people. And you can't do that simply by mobilizing the people. Because if you put 1 million people in the streets today and they dissipate the next day, you have not built anything. Organization is about building something. Because it's not just you just show up at a demonstration. What do you do every day towards your objectives? Are the workers organized here? Are the workers organized? All those people who work in these foreign corporations, these foreign grocery stores and these foreign businesses, are they organized as workers? I mean, can they go in and say, we need a living wage, that the prices have gone up, we can't buy what we need to live? They're not organized. So even if they come out for one day and show their frustration, they can't sustain it. They can't sustain it because they're not organized. It's only an organized force that can defeat another organized force. So we look at, you can rebel. You can even make it hot. You know, you can break into the parliament, and you can put some pressure on them. But if you are not organized to sustain that kind of struggle, then you'll never win that struggle. And it's our job, all of us who think that we're or claim to want to organize our people, to get this over to our people. Join an organization. If you don't join an organization, you're not serious. I don't know. I don't care how much how loud, how violent you might be at any point in time. This is what I'm born in the States. This is what we found out. When Martin Luther King was killed, the masses of Africans in the United States jumped up and burned down 200 cities. I mean, they had big rebellions, throwing Molotov cocktail bombs and everything. Many people died in these battles. But then they sat down for another 20 years. Organization means you're working every day. Because if this rebellion simply is a rebellion for 2024, and we don't see it again till 2044, what have we done? That's why we can't think of it as just one generation. You organize across generations. What we want to see is 20, 30 years later, the same Gen Z people organize with the next successive generations and organizations. One generation teaching and the next generation the essence of the struggle. What is the struggle? What in 2044 is different than what happened in 2024? What did we gain between 2024 and 2044? We want to use our mobilizations in terms of only as a tactic in an organizational framework. Mobilization, yes, organizers mobilize, but mobilizers don't always organize. And that's when the power is lost. It's just an enigma in the struggle. It's just a second. Organizers like Dedan Kimathi didn't just organize for one event. They were in the streets. I know it formally talks about from 1952 till 1960. That means they were struggling for 8 years in the forest. But really, it started before 1952, and it ended after 1960s because some people did refuse to give up. So this is what we're talking about, organization. You know, people who organize all their lives. People like Malcolm X. Malcolm X was never not in an organization. Martin Luther King was in an organization. If you're not in an organization, then you're just a moment. We can only, you did a great thing. We can applaud that you did this one great thing, but you didn't stay in the struggle. The struggle is a permanent reality. Once you decide what your objective is, that's why capitalism continues to reorganize from generation to generation. They know what they want. They want capitalism. Those of us who are on revolutionaries, those of us who are revolutionary Pan-Africanism, we Pan-Africanists, we want one united socialist Africa. And I understand that there were people who started this organizing for this way before I was born. I've given my adult life to it for over 44 years. So I have to understand that I'm not doing it just for me. All I can do is organize so that the next generation can take it on. Organization, in the final analysis, as Kwame Nkrumah said, decides everything. How you organize, how you organize permanent struggle is the only path to victory.
Yes, organization is the only path to victory. Thank you very much, Comrade Sobukwe. Always a pleasure. I think we've seen what the essence of the struggle for the Land and Freedom Army is and was. We've seen the essence of the legacy of Dedan Kimathi, Field Marshal Dedan Kimathi, and we look forward to continuing the struggle that the generations before were engaging in. We look forward to continuing this struggle and to achieve liberation, not only for all the people of Africa, but for all the people of the world as well. Always a pleasure having Comrade Sobukwe Shukura from the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I've been your host, Maghanga from the Revolutionary Socialist League. Please look out for more details regarding this year's commemoration of Kimathi Day to take place on the 18th of February. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Dedan lives.
Dedan lives. Kimathi lives.
Hizi pingu zimenifunga zikanishinda kusonga mbele, nashindwa kanta shinda hapa milele, nahitaji ukombozi sahi, nahitaji ukombozi sahi.